All right. We are recording. Hey, Jay. So I'm here with Jay Dicharry. I always get this wrong. Is it Dicharry, Dickory? How do you say it?
Dicharry.
Dicharry. That's what I thought.
Yep.
Okay. Can you just explain really briefly who you are and what you do?
Yeah, I'm a physical therapist, and I kind of blend the worlds of kind of clinical care and biomechanical analysis. One of the things that I love to do is to take a lot of modern technology we have and actually use instrument gait evaluations to find out not just the ouches, but more importantly, why you're having those ouches, and then what we can do to optimize people for performance potential.
Right. And I first became aware of you, I think, like maybe 5 years ago. There was a Running Times video, I think it was, kind of detailing your work with a college athlete. But back when you were at UVA, I think, actually.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and that was kind of my first introduction to you. And then you put out this great book called Anatomy for Runners, which was your first book ever, right? That was your first project? Right. Yeah.
It
And
was.
that was really eye-opepening for me because it kind of, as you're saying, explained causes behind things instead of saying, okay, well, your knee hurts, fix this, we'll put some lacrosse ball there and we'll fix the tissue and get you back out running. But that's kind of useless unless you're fixing the underlying cause of why you're in pain in the first place. So that was the first book. And now you have this great new book that we're going to talk about today, Running Rewired, which I really, really like a lot. I feel like there's so much information overload right now. There's a lot of information out there and it's amazing. You have like Mobility Wad, and you have all these coaches on Instagram who are posting really useful, everyone from, Great Cook to PTs across the world posting really interesting takes on movement and, things you can kind of play with, like from the guys at On It, for instance, posting steel mace workouts. So all kinds of cool information, but I do feel like there's a bit of information overload because once you have all this information, it's kind of hard to know what to do with it. And one of the things that I like about this new book a lot is that it makes a very clear case for why why you're writing about what you're writing about. But then at the end of the book, you have these sort of an array of options for workouts. You have the precision workouts, right, that are more balanced stability, and then sort of strength, and then power, which are more plyometrics. But you're very clear about, hey, just once, twice a week, pick one or two from column A. Once, twice a week, pick a few from column B. And that kind of eliminates all of the guesswork, which I really appreciate. So could you talk a little bit about how this book differs from the first book?
Yeah, I mean, so you hit the nail on the head, Greg. It's the idea for this book was, Anatomy for Runners. It was a great book, and I think found it filled a very interesting niche, right? It wasn't a textbook, but it wasn't also written for, and forgive me to anybody who's listening, but it wasn't written for the general runner's world audience, right? It was written for people who really do want answers and are willing to put the time in and effort in. I always tell people, there's no magic pill, right? If you want to get better, you can get better, and it will take strategically organized time and work, but you'll get there. And that book was written, for that audience to kind of, I think, to fix people and get people what I call your best ground zero, right? And I think that the goal of Running Rewired was sort of twofold. One, I wanted to hit a bigger, broader audience. And then so it's a little less technical than Anatomy for Runners was, for sure. I say the concepts are still identical. More things we added in. But more importantly, I think that I wanted to have some things that were deployable, right? At the end of the day, I mean, I personally think people need to understand the why of why they're going to take time to do things. But then more importantly, I mean, you're right. It's a tool at the end to have those workouts to make it very simple and deployable. And you hit the nail on the head. It's like, there's so much stuff out there these days. And, it's hard to blend, okay, well, what's good for runners versus what's good for, just somebody who's just trying to get general fitness versus what's good for CrossFit versus what's good for obstacle course racing. And, this book is very much targeted towards running performance. And I think that, before you talk about, all runners must squat 300 pounds or all runners must run 80 miles per week. It's like, well, let's stay back and make sense of this stuff and find out how you can actually get your body to move better. Because, people always want to talk about running form. And I'm like, man, you can't get to running form. The reason why you can't figure out what to do with your form is because you don't even know how to, hip hinge properly, right? So, it's building skill and movement to build skill in running.
Yeah, one thing that I've sort of come around to over the years, I mean, I think I sort of had a very traditional entrance to running where you first just join a running club and start running a bunch, whatever pace, whatever distance, and then you get injured inevitably. Unless you're one of the very few who just like happens to move very well, without even trying to, which is probably like 1% of the running population. But then you start getting injured, and then you go, okay, well, why am I injured? And then you go, okay, well, say you have IT band pain. Eventually you might learn, okay, well, it's actually the hip. Maybe work on the hip tissues, right? And then you think, well, it's not just the tissue, it's actually how I'm moving that's causing the tissue to hurt in the first place. And you kind of go down this rabbit hole with it. But I think one of the things I like about the current moment we're in is that there is a lot more emphasis placed on movement quality. And you hear Kelly Starrett talk about this a lot too. Running's a skill. I think you mentioned it in the book as well. Yep. Running's a skill that you have to learn the same way you learn how to throw a javelin or drive a car, and yet for some reason we go, well, yeah, just run the way you should run, which would be great in theory if we all didn't sit at desks all day. I mean, I'm lucky to be able to stand up most of the day, working from home, and even when I'm on a job, I could kind of work that in there. But most people, are long commutes, they're at desks, they're in a shoe with a big heel, even if they're a man, right? Still is probably a half an inch heel there, closed toe box. So we just kind of like undo all these things that you see little kids doing effortlessly. So I do think there is a certain impetus or onus rather on the runner now to kind of go, like you said, get back to your kind of square one or, your ground zero, and then start building training from there. Because I think most of us, we've built really good aerobic engines just from, working out a lot and we're fit, but we don't actually have a strong base of functionality. And I think there's the kind of parallel tracks of performance and health. And I would probably place functionality in the health category as well as performance too, obviously it certainly benefits it. But I actually, this 2016 was the Olympic trials here in LA for Rio for the marathon. And the gap in movement quality between, let's say, the top 10 men and top 10 women and the bottom 10 men and bottom 10 women was like almost a different sport. Right. You watch the top 10, watching even Shalane Flanagan at the New York Marathon this past, or last month, at the end, she has that great sort of 10K runner kick, just the leg, the extension she gets is amazing. And then you see the people who came in maybe 10th even, not bad. 10th New York City Marathon's incredible. Right. And they look like how you think, if my grandfather were still alive, of how he would run, kind of shuffling. And so that should say everything right there. They're all getting access to the same coaches, the same training, but it just, this one moves better than that one.
Yeah, and people forget, people tend to look at just those race shoot finishes and how does their form look. Well, realize the better athletes out there aren't just looking good in the race shoot. They need to focus on form and control and body awareness and body movement, because guess what? They don't have the ability to take off 6 weeks after that marathon and kind of rest and recover from the aches and pains they're going to have. Like, they have to jump back in the training again. So It's not just about that one race. It's about what happens after trials. There's the Olympics, right? What happens after after districts, there's state. What happens after, your local 10K, there's something else in your goal list. So it's not about just surviving for that race, but it's about making sure you're healthy and stable for the entire season, right? Your body gets really good at what it practices. And if you practice this, kind of like you said before, most of us just kind of hang out, watch Netflix all day long and put shoes on and expect to run like a canyon. Good luck with that.
Right.
So, if you strive for perfect form with an imperfect body, it means you're fighting yourself. And a lot of the listeners right now, if you've tried to do things for form work and gotten frustrated and said, this doesn't work. And for the coaches out there who always say, oh, form training doesn't work. Well, of course, if you're used to, moving one way all the time, and I just tell you to change things, the body's like, this is too much to think about. If you give me 10 things to think about when I run, and that's the overload, right?
Right.
If I'm doing run cues with somebody, I'm giving them 1 to 2 things only to think about. Right now, maybe change most things certain times, but when you're running, you're in contact with the ground less than a quarter of a second. You don't have time to process 10,000 technical aspects. And if you built this database of proper movement awareness and proper control of your body, that's something to call back on. You go, oh, this feels just like the routine I practiced, right? And so some people might say, oh, well, yeah, it's books, it's a bunch of exercises. Well, you know what? It's a bunch of mental training, right? It's a bunch of mental mental muscle training to figure out how to move correctly and to build muscle memory patterns so you can call on those when you're, tired, when you're struggling, when you're trying to hit your eighth 400 repeat in the track, right? You don't have time to think about, gee, am I focusing on my correct stride mechanics? That's the time to execute.
Right. Well, that speaks to the title of the book too. Running Rewired refers to this idea of neuroplasticity and just sort of training yourself to move a little differently, right? I mean, so much of it, I think if you could probably draw one of the biggest distinctions in the book, and one of the biggest things for runners that most don't do is we are anterior dominant versus posterior dominant. So we're, that foot's coming way out and we're kind of almost pulling into our stride versus pushing into the stride. And you have a great image that I think is probably in the first book too, but the idea of sort of symmetry, right? The foot should swing out in front or rather, I'll say the foot should push back as far as it swings out in front. And if you have this sort of anterior dominant thing, you're barely getting to, sort of neutral in extension.
Yep.
And you watch so many runners and you can just see it. If you go out on any running route in your city, I know you're in Bend, you're probably surrounded by better runners than we are here in LA, I'll say. But, you see people running, and if they get to like 1 degree of extension, it's a lot. And the rest is just kind of like this kind of very front kind of thing.
Yeah, and what's happened is interesting, right? I mean, so we had this whole movement over the past few years as far as like telling everybody, okay, well, stop overstriding and shorten your cadence and increase cadence, right?
Right, 180 steps per minute. Yeah.
So what that's done is, right, and so I look at things from a mechanistic standpoint. A lot of runners have actually improve or overstride less since this message got out there. But the problem is they're not, again, I call that the pendulum, right? So think about the legs swinging forward, the legs swinging back. So, increasing turnover, shortening your stride has gotten people to stop overstriding, but then they haven't learned to be able to drive further out the back, right?
Right,
and
right.
That's the problem is. So it's like, the reason we talk about, front side versus backside muscles, the goal is all those muscles in the backside are going to help push you along, right? And so there's less what we call eccentric or lengthened contraction done, which causes us to really get tired. Those of you who ever run long downhill runs, the reason why your legs feel shredded is because you're basically put a bunch of lengthening contraction on top of muscles. And bringing that leg closer to you can minimize that kind of that wear and tear. But then more importantly, you always think about, I want to push when I run, right? If I can get the idea behind pushing forward, that's what uses propulsion muscles. And then you can get to that ultimate balance. What I talk about in the book is, if you can get to the point where half your running effort comes from muscle and half it comes from stored release of energy in the tendons, that's the holy grail, right? They're trying to get running to be very elastic.
Right. Versus probably, would you say most of the ratio right now is all muscle and very little tendon?
Not all muscle, but I mean, there's certainly a lot of muscle. A lot of tendon.
A little more of an imbalance.
Yeah.
Sorry, hold on 1 second. Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, very professional operation here. I had bacon in the oven and had to turn it off.
All good.
So I'm curious. So you see like a lot of really elite athletes at your clinic. It's the Rebound Clinic up in Bend, Oregon. I was there in 2014, I think it was. And you see probably everything from mountain bikers to ultra marathoners to track athletes. What would you say? I mean, obviously the book probably answers a lot of this question that I'll ask, but like, what do you see mostly in runners? I mean, when they come to you, because it seems like in the book you give kind of real world examples of clients you've seen. And it seems like often the fixes are not terribly extensive either, which is nice. Like it's a few weeks often and you're seeing some progress. So kind of walk me through that. Someone comes into you, what do you typically see and how do you assess them?
Yeah, so I think that, this is a great question. So when most runners come in, you mentioned before, they've done a bunch of cardiovascular training, right? Their heart and lungs have gotten developed, but when it comes to, we use an analogy of the chassis versus the engine, right? I mean, their skeletal structure is not able to support what they output, their heart and lungs can put out, right? So, and when you look at this, I break these down into sort of two kind of categories, right? There's people who are weak and there's people who are inhibited. And those are very different things, right?
Right.
So,
can you elaborate that a little bit?
Yeah, and so
because we always work on these sort of like glute med things that are great, like banded walks and all the rest of it. But if we actually can't turn the muscle on, it's kind of irrelevant.
Right, and so you get into people who say, "Oh, your hips aren't firing, or your butt's not firing," and the reality is that That's fun to talk about from the lay world. A lot of people say, "Oh, that's not accurate." I mean, the reality is, you can actively fire a muscle, right?
Mm-hmm.
Anybody can turn a muscle on and make it work. And some people are stronger and weaker at that, but anybody can fire a muscle. But we talk about muscles being unplugged. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
I use the analogy in the book about the toaster, right? So
Right.
if you're trying to make toast, and you put your bread in the toaster, and you hit the button, you walk away, and you come back, and the toaster didn't toast, right? You don't just shove more bread in the toaster and hope it works. Right. The first thing you do is you figure out, gee, why didn't this work? Is a toaster even plugged in? Right. So, what about your stride mechanics is taking advantage of that neural muscle control, right? So we talk about muscle being unplugged. We're saying running gait's reflexive, right? You don't think about the way you run, you just go, right? And so that pattern of building reflexive movement, so taking those hip muscles and incorporating them into your stride, that's the way to fix inhibition, right? And a lot of runners have this like aha moment after about, 3 to 6 weeks, and like, oh my gosh, I feel like a different person when I run. And we
Mm-hmm.
haven't done anything in terms of strength. I mean,
Right.
literally nothing, right? But what you've done is your brain is now aware how to get your hip muscles to incorporate into your running mechanics.
Mm-hmm.
And that is like this like total like mind-blowing experience of, wow, not only do I, somebody telling me I'm doing something wrong, but I feel what I need to do correct,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And that's that first like aha moment. And so, I make a bunch of workouts in the book called precision
Mm-hmm.
workouts, right? And those are just, they're not very fatiguing, right? They
No,
take 15 to 18 minutes to run
I did
through.
mine this morning.
Yeah, awesome. but they're quick, dirty, and again, I'm trying to make them accessible, right? So some of
Mm-hmm.
you need nothing, some you need like a Swiss ball, some you need just TRX or a sling trainer.
Yeah.
Simple equipment, and they're designed to get you to kind of move with precision, right? To learn how to control your body, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's certainly one huge part of the equation. And the next part, where Anatomy for Runners really didn't have the opportunity to cover a lot of this, people said, okay, well, I feel awesome. Like, what's the next step, right? And so, you talk about, the strength and power training for running. Again, it's not CrossFit, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
you don't have to go in there and do 10 sets of deadlifts. You don't have to go in there and max out every day. And, all the stuff we hear, super slow lifting sets and stuff like that. We take 10 seconds to lower and 5 seconds
Mm-hmm.
to come up, and isometric work. And that stuff doesn't transfer to running. You look
Mm-hmm.
at the research out there on power training for running athletes, and it's all about a certain method to the madness, right? To get you to be able to put more force down on the ground for a more efficient stride. And there's a direct correlation behind how we train our strength and power work and how it directly improves running economy. And if
Right.
you're sitting there doing heavy isometric holds and super slow lifting and all these crazy compound sets that take forever to move the bar, not only does that stuff make you exhausted and you're sore for days, but it doesn't actually improve running.
Mm-hmm.
And so I try to do things that are very specific to improving running form.
Right. Well, I really like that about the book too, because again, there's so much information out there that you really have done a nice job at distilling things to kind of like the essence. Like, yes, I think you may have mentioned in the book, are there more things I could have added to this? Of course there are. But are these the, 20% that's going to get you the 80% of the results? Yes.
Totally.
And I like that a lot because we're not professional athletes. I mean, I write for TV and I make bacon on the side. I have a real passion for the sport and for, constantly learning about it, but it's ultimately not my livelihood, and I don't have all day to spend. And I probably have more time to spend, honestly, than most people do just by nature of my schedule. But this is great. 20 minutes, probably once, twice a week for the precision, once, twice a week for the strength. You maybe add plyometrics further into the season, kind of closer to your race, and you're good to go. And I think that kind of that also speaks to the consistency of it. Anyone can go out and run 20 miles. I can do that right now if I want to, but can you put in that subtle training, for weeks and weeks and weeks and months on end, and then incorporating this stuff kind of frees you up to just, it might not seem very overwhelming, right? It's 20 minutes of bear crawls and things like that, but you do it. And I think there's real benefit in that kind of small consistency, because you probably are going to stick with it more than if it was like, hey, here's an hour every day after your long run and before your second run, and I was actually showing a friend, again, not a PT, but I was showing a friend a hip hinge because he was having really bad back pain. So let me see how you move. And I brought a kettlebell over to his office and I said, pick this up. And he just did this, kind of just folded forward. And it took us about an hour finally I was able to cue him to get his butt back. I had a little packet of note cards and said, hit this pack of cards with your butt. And he goes, am I there yet? I said, no. Am I there yet? And finally he got the hip hinge. And I had him just do 10 reps of hip hinging every hour after I had left. And the next day he said he was as sore as he could remember. And this is hip hinging. This is not with a 20-pound kettlebell. So
Yeah,
I think,
yeah.
yeah,
I have
breaking things
exercise.
up.
It's in the book. I've got the chair of death exercise, which I
Yes.
thought was funny.
Yeah.
I used to call this the broomstick squats. Nobody
Uh-huh.
did it, and now I call it the chair of death. People love it,
Yeah.
but it amazes
Right.
me. I mean, I would say probably half the runners I see, literally, okay. So this exercise involves basically, taking a broomstick or a piece of PVC pipe. You put it along your back of your body, and you put a little either a box or a bench or something in front of you, right? And all you have to do is just sit down behind you, right? Just squat
Right.
down behind you. And it
I'm
amazes me
looking
how many
forward to the
people literally look at me and go, I don't know how to do this. Like they
book. Right. Here it is.
down, right? Because they're so slumped. It's like you said, that they move the way they know, right? So you feed in that quad dominant pattern, and so like people their mind blows up, right? And so before you talk about even, and I have in the book, I was like, look, do not walk in the weight room, do not put any bar in your hands until you can do a proper hip hinge for a deadlift and a proper chair or desk squat, right?
Yeah.
Because those are fundamental movement patterns. But you build that muscle memory. Again, this goes in that kind of that inhibition stuff, right? We're fixing for our movement first. Then we get to a point we can actually, okay, now I'm ready to put some load on top of this, right? And that's that next piece.
Right. Right. Well, I mean, I think too, it's like I recently reread Born to Run for the first time in a while, and there's a great line in the book of how the Tara Umar weren't good runners; they're actually just good athletes. And I think that distinction, look, running straight in a line is really fun. I love marathons, but I want to be a good athlete. I want to be able to do what my body is meant to do, not just run straight and end up a frail, skinny little runner. I know you have to be out at 10:35. Maybe we can do a round 2 at some point because there's so much to talk about with this book. And I really encourage everyone to pick it up. It's Running Rewired, Jay Dicharry. Any last words or anywhere we can find you online?
Yeah, just one little thing too. So
Yes,
I'd say
please, by all
a
means.
lot of the runners. Yeah, one last little point. A lot of the runners. Obviously, we do this stuff because we're competitive, whether it's with ourselves, or our friends, or our neighbors, or our club, or our country, right? And so, a lot of people who maybe a little apprehensive about some of those things in the performance workouts and seem a little overwhelming. Take your time on those. If those seem a little crazy to do a bunch of new things, maybe I have in the book just do one set of those exercises the first time. But you're competitive with yourself for a reason, and it's kind of fun to see not just progress in running, but see some progress in some other things. And I think with all the athletes I work with who, you take time to get in the weight room and do some things that are programmed the right way, it's pretty amazing to see your body improve in ways that you really didn't know were there. So it's a fun way to, again, to make you a better athlete, make you a better runner, and, better long-term health and enjoyment of life too. So it's all good.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, Jay, thank you so much for the work you do. And where can we find you online? You have a website, right?
Yeah. Reporegon.com is our website for work. And you can find us on Instagram. You can also look at anathletesbody.com as my blog. And I have lots of good stuff out there to share.
Awesome, Jay. Well, you're the man. And thank you very much.
Thanks, Greg.
All right.